Welcome back to PCVB's Banking Out Loud podcast. I'm Virginia Robbins, your host for today's episode on CECL, or the Current Expected Credit Loss Accounting Standard. With me, I have Andy Hines, who works with a public financial institution, and he's already been through the CECL journey. During our conversation, Andy will share with you his priorities, how he made it through the journey, and his experiences.
I think the top recommendation is to really focus on your loan classifications and that trial balance and the loan maturities, which is a data field that most can pull from their core, to really ensure that the data that you're going to need to grab is encompassed in there well.
Because we have a lot to discuss, our conversation has been broken into two parts. Today, part one, Andy will share with us the lessons learned from CECL, specifically on organizing data and explaining CECL results to his stakeholders. Then in part two, we'll discuss his experience with getting started with CECL, his exposure and participation, and how his institution prepared for CECL. He'll also touch on challenges with spreadsheets. So with that, why don't we get started?
Hi, Andy. Great to have you with us today. I understand in your background that you went for flying for the Navy to underwriting the companies whose planes you flew. What was that journey like in your career, and where are you today?
When I was at Cornell, I had a Navy scholarship. I really thought I wanted to be an astronaut. That there was a lot of hopefulness for all of that before the Challenger disaster. I studied biochemistry and statistics and whatnot. So it was always, kind of more of a thinker than a feeler, I guess. And then went to flight school upon commissioning and, always loved airplanes growing up. So that was great. The Navy gave me the opportunity to go back and get my MBA in a program with a bunch of other defense contractors in the early 90s. And then I kind of revisited topics I really liked, which was statistics and quantitative analysis and finance. I just love the numbers. I like the analysis. I like predictive analytics. I like behavioral finance. Later with getting into the civilian world, I still stayed with reserves through the 90s. But, I would say that some of that, when we would try to use predictive analytics for strike planning and so on, I just was interested in that kind of analysis and prediction and so on. And there has been a terrific amount of change that all of us in this business, have had to adapt to. I was with a correspondent bank in the Mid-Atlantic for a while, which was a lot of fun because we banked a whole collection of smaller regional financial institutions. And that was one of the best chapters in my career because, again, in your banking career, you get really isolated. You don't get a lot of feedback about, best practice across other institutions. Well, there, I also became the president of our loan review function. And it was during the Great Recession, so I really got to see a lot of spilt milk and work with a lot of, people that were struggling through the Great Recession. Saw a lot of regulatory commentary. It was very informative.
When working with the regulators, have you found the discussion? Over time, we have seen at times regulators and accountants take different positions on reserves.
Yeah.
How have you seen the discussions with regulators towards CECL?
So far, they've, even during the process of preparation for CECL, and I believe it was in a FIL a number of years ago, Financial Institutions Letter, and they basically laid out to banks what they believe should be the appropriate roadmap to CECL implementation. And I know I use this. I used it in, advising to others and sharing with other professionals like myself. Organize yourself around those recommendations because they are familiar with that. And so that was during the long implementation process because they were concerned about risks associated with you being prepared to make the transition on whatever deadlines, and it applies to different institutions, they might be. I recall that in the small financial institution, when the regulatory community became much more engaged on ALM analysis and sensitivity and so on, that initially we had to make transitions to black box type models, and where the confidence develops, and this is just something everybody has to understand, you make reasonable kind of assumptions about it going in, but it'll be a multi-year process as you backtest the assumptions in those models, and then eventually there's a confidence that's developed by all stakeholders. But it takes time. Nobody is just going to come right out of the blocks, 100% confident, and that's okay. It's not because I've seen how this works with other types of bank modeling, and has a lot to do with your process, your awareness that that's how it's going to work. In the end, it probably will be better, because you're not, there's a whole nother side of people like me in these small companies that's terrified by these 20 tab Excel spreadsheets that are your own black box model. That just they're just too error prone. Because again, companies have been trying, once they invest so much into that Excel spreadsheet, we went through the turn of the century. So we're in the aughts, and then you're trying to drag along your methodologies in the 2005 to 2008 time frame. The call report's changing, wants more detail, and you get wedded to these internal models that you use in data collection, and it's actually very non-adaptable. If you have to build systems mindful of how it's going to continue to change and evolve. And even this will, I'll guarantee you.
For you personally, what were some of the biggest changes you saw between incurred loss and CECL? Did you have any aha moments or any surprises?
Well, I think it confirmed things that I knew would kind of happen, like the one that I just described to you, where you might have a consumer portfolio where the losses have been a little elevated. But then under the new modeling, because the portfolio turns over so quickly, you actually wind up with less reserves. Or on the flip side, a lot of small institutions that had portfolios of seasoned residential mortgage loans, they could be in the business. They were, because, they did a good job of making loans in their community. They had very few losses. But now when you start to do the calculation out into the future, it shifts around your entire perspective on potential risks. I have always been a strong advocate of organizing your risk management processes in the bank to parallel, FFIEC type of purpose and classification codes, meaning that, how you manage things inside the bank should look a lot like the schedules in the call report. And that just helps on all kinds of fronts, because now when the regulator comes in, they don't have to recalibrate their eyeballs. It starts with ensuring that the way you have your data organized is consistent with the way someone has grown used to seeing it from your uniform bank performance reports, from your call reports, and so on. The kind of information that we were all kind of terrified when CECL first started getting discussed, there'd be lists of like, oh, these 15 data points you need to track all the time. And, nobody was really sure how many of those data points. Is just like, okay, so first thing you have to do is just start tracking everything. And, your wheels start turning in your head on like, how am I going to accomplish that? And the years spent committing yourself to to making what you use for risk management look virtually identical to how they're looking at you all the time from the outside in terms of portfolio segmentation, loss histories, peer groups. I mean, you can pull peer groups on UBPR. And if you're going to do any of that to backfill in portfolios where you haven't had loss history, do yourself a big favor and make it more consistent, not less consistent, with the kind of information they've already been getting. And I've said that to people about the forward look. Whatever you're doing on the ALM should be exactly the same, more or less, what you're doing for this analysis. Because the extent to which you reduce what appear to be contradictions is the extent to which it's one less question you're answering. People can see it, there's a logic to it, and so on.
Yeah, and it's also FASB is actually looking for consistency.
Oh yeah, again, and looking at banks, when we were doing consulting and loan review and all kinds of things, I'd always start out by doing my homework like the regulator does with the UBPR. Anything that's outstanding, you're on the wrong side of a percentile. Just like a regulator, I could build a checklist for myself before I even got in there. And you'd be amazed at how many bankers were using a completely different methodology for risk management. And I'd hear it all the time. They're like, I don't understand why they're asking me these questions. And I'm like, well, I know why they're asking you those questions. Because have you looked at your UBPR lately? And, I get people hadn't. And I said, you've really got to be aware of that. And however you're risk managing internally, I would make it more consistent, not less consistent. You may have a few metrics that are particularly insightful to you, but otherwise you're not going to be prepared for their point of view or their questions or what have you. And two, they're like a doctor. They've seen 1,000 test results. They're never going to, they just know what they know, and they're generally right,
So, Andy, I'm curious. Given your background in analytics, you seem to be like almost the target person to build their own spreadsheet. Now, there is the issue of model risk, and there's validating the spreadsheet, and there's maintaining the spreadsheet, and all of that. But there are, in some cases, we have CECL methods like Scale, which are, a relatively simple spreadsheet-based system. What's your opinion of for a small bank moving in that direction? What are your thoughts there?
So there's, there are potential hurdles for everyone that's trying to figure out what their roadmap for CECL implementation will be. And I would say that one of the lowest hurdles has been the data analytics tools, even to subscribe. I looked at this initially where kind of like I used to with, fair lending type tools, totally internally, do my own mapping, because you have a better understanding of it, which is great, but the cost of the tools that are available I felt that it doesn't justify some of the other risks you have to address. And the other risks you have to address are significant. For example, our world is always changing, and a terrific value you have in engaging with, a big company that's going to host your core processing and other things like that, is that I always tell people, if you're a gazelle and you just come across the field and it's like completely empty, you're like, oh, this is great. That's not the first thing that should go through your head. You go, why aren't there other gazelles here? Because there's some kind of danger I'm not aware of. And when you're in a herd, somebody else, there's a great risk management benefit, to having the right kinds of vendor relationships. So cost is one of them. I mean, the true cost, even if I buy a piece of software or I work on it, I really have to be honest about my time. This kind of analysis is a cost center. It's not really a profit center. I am a business developer. I've got to manage this. But I really need to bring business in as well. And I can't just be the analysis department. And that's this thing with the small banks. There's a terrific value in like what we're doing right now, or having working groups or networking, or being with a really solid vendor, because when somebody across the field sees the lion, I don't need to see the lion. I'm confident if they've seen it, I believe them. We'll just start, making changes and adapt to that. So yeah, it's kind of like that. And then finally, obviously, is everybody, reasonably so, is very preoccupied with, managerial controls, and you just can't, you can't be independent enough. So even if we were doing it, I'd have to engage a third party. So there we're back to cost again. I mean, if I'm doing it completely, I've already got third parties, for certain aspects of it, but it would really, I think if you're a really large institution, you can probably make it work. Smaller ones, you're going to have to outsource it. It's just like ALM and the sensitivity modeling.
Or your core system, or any of the other things that you outsource.
For example, your loan documentation.
Right.
I used to run into banks that just have been working their own documentation off of shelf documents for consumer loans, for years. It worked, never had any problem. And, you could just imagine how non-compliant that can become. But if you're working with a company, that is indemnifying that, that's keeping up with it, then you can focus on the stuff where you're really going to make a difference, because no one can keep up with all of the nuances of, some of the regulatory changes. It's just like mortgage documentation. You don't want to do that at home, in-house.
In-house, right.
Yeah.
So, Andy, we touched on a little bit about implementation, and you are on the other side of that now with your CECL implementation. So what would be when you sit back and look at it, in the rearview mirror, what were the sort of like the three top, or, handful of top best things that you said, gosh, I'm really glad we did that, or in hindsight, I really wish I'd spent more time on this?
Well, I'm a great believer that a lot of your time spent is thinking about many considerations in parallel. It's really not a linear process. And if it gets too linear, then you're overly committed to something you've started doing when you discover that it didn't include something else. So, it takes a good degree of, experience and communication and awareness to know, okay, if I set this piece up, then that's also going to meet the requirements on this other area. And then, of course, everything you do, I know that I'm going to have to build it so that it can be easily audited, so that there are functional work papers, so that it's not overwhelming, so that so you're thinking on multiple levels on how this is going to kind of come together. And when I joined this bank, I'd already had strong feelings about the topic I talked about a few moments ago, which is organizing your internal structure to mirror how you're already reporting in other areas. And why? Because you're going to be more efficient, because you're simultaneously answering questions to multiple parties. All those things have to be thought about and incorporated. And, on the roadmap to CECL that the financial institution letter addressed, they were pretty clear, back in 12, 14, and so on. Now's the time to start shifting your portfolios around, adding data to open fields in your loan accounting systems and whatnot, so that when you get to the stage of actually putting information into a model, you've already taken a huge potential error out of it. So I'm very glad that I had good support where I am for the idea of reclassifying the loans and scrubbing the loan accounting system and using extra fields appropriately to, mindful of when eventually somebody's going to ask me for a list of this or a list of that, or the data has to be mapped. And that goes to, HMDA and CRA. When PPP came in, I mean, before I even could really digest PPP, I was already thinking, I'm going to get asked a lot of questions about this a year or 2 years down the road. What are the data pieces I want to tag every loan with so that I'm able to answer those questions later on? Even with CECL, if I hadn't, thought about that and tagged them in the right way, then when it came to doing the modeling, forecasting for it, or, even applying the reserve, it wouldn't be as good as it is right now because they're very unique kind of loans.
Okay.
So
Andy, we have some folks who, thought CECL was perhaps going away, hoped maybe it wouldn't apply to them, and are coming to the CECL bandwagon now, shall we say. And so for those folks, for those bankers, how would you, they've got to do perhaps a fair amount of work relatively quickly now. What would be your top recommendation to them?
So I think the top recommendation is to really focus on your loan classifications and that trial balance, and the loan maturities, which is a data field, that most can pull from their core, to really ensure that the data that you're going to need to grab is encompassed in there well. When I keep harping on loan classifications, the reason why I've been so preoccupied with it, why I was preoccupied with it, years ago, when more detail started creeping into the call report, is because the detail winds up in the UBPR. And then you've got somebody that's looked at it, sees where you are percentile wise, and do you have a problem, or have you guys just lumped too many loans in the wrong category? Well, now, in order to build up that loss history, in order to have a functional peer analysis, you have to be aligned with everybody else's call report data and loss history and so on. If that data piece isn't taken care of, you're going to have a very difficult time with the rest of it. If that data piece, and it's not overly complicated, but you take care of it. And in some cases, lenders are going to have to jump in, know what they want to accomplish, and then engage with, data processors to do mass file changes, whatever it is, so that they get the trial balance presentation that makes them comparable to peers, that enables them to both summarize their own loss history, but do the comparison to others. Because the black box model, if it has that data properly, that it can map to it correctly, the kinds of assumptions that, you have to make in it, most of them are self-evident. I don't think there is a huge amount of complexity there or anything. Okay. And then you're going to get an output of it and you should be fine. Okay. All the other issues we talked about, communication, you're still going to have those. But if I had to say, where is the effort? 60% of the effort is in the quality of that data. The model piece, especially if a vendor is working with you, is not high effort. And the output of it is going to be a lot simpler than anything you've dealt with before. And then finally, you've got your communication piece and so on.
Right. So it's making sure that your note department and your lenders and your chief financial officer are all working together to make sure that something that the note department might have done to help them speed along isn't going to create a problem for you down the road.
Yeah, I mean, when people, how did I sell it internally? Everybody has a job to do in the bank, and everybody's mostly focused on their job. I knew that there were some things that if you can tweak them or improve data analysis, then all of a sudden you're meeting the needs of other people in the bank too. Believe me that, if you can lead the way and map it out, you will get the engagement of the CFO because he'd love to have it, the fidelity of it improved so that call reporting looks a lot like financial reporting. The people in the loan operations areas, they'd love to have it, correct as well, because many of them in older banks have dealt with a legacy of different definitions for loans over the last 25 years. Right. And it makes it very difficult for them every time they're asked to generate a business analytics report or something like that. All of these things, to the extent that people can understand it's going to pay dividends for them and what they contribute to the bank in all areas, I think it makes it a lot easier. I don't know. That's what I've tried. That's been my approach. I think if you just give people checklists, they already have a lot of work. They just they don't get it. But if you can say to them, listen, if we get this wired up, there's going to be virtually our call reporting system. You're just going to be reviewing it. It's not and the same thing with booking loans. If we get this wired up, then like me and some of the other people, I just see a daily trial balance. I can see right away if something's out of whack. But you also have to have your credit people, agree to making it very clear every time they book a loan what the purpose code is. Because that's, if they don't, so everybody has a vested interest, but then in the end, they're like, this is working a lot better. Yeah. Yeah, it's working a lot better. Because, we all have to keep doing the same things over and over again where we're providing information, in reports to regulators and auditors and internal management. And, people just want it to work correctly. Right. If it's an institution where, and again, I used to go into some of these places where, they had, here's the report and here's the kind of Rosetta Stone you got to decode, and then and because that's how you can figure out how they got to the call report, And I'm like, holy smoke already, and it's like arrows, and I'm like, oh boy, because, even a lot of the people who are just working hard in a bank, huge amount of anxiety for them that eventually comes back to them, summarize something, they missed one, row, and now that's through. It shouldn't work that way. If you get it set up correctly on the data side, as that data goes in, then it's a functional tool for everybody in the bank. And CECL is just one part of it. ALM, everything else kind of feeds off of it.
Yeah, you remind me, Andy, that at the end of the day, when I served as a chief operating officer, I figured out one time up to a third of my time was spent on either regulatory or internal or external audit issues. Yeah. And if you can reduce that, then that's time spent with customers. So you can move from being, cost center activity to revenue generation activity. And that's, that's huge. That's in a time now where we're all looking to ways to improve profits. This is actually an internal investment that doesn't take much effort. It just takes everybody getting on board and moving forward. And you can make a material change in profits.
I mean, in naval aviation, which is my formative thing, and we always loved having just like these short statements about everything, that way you always knew what to do. And, we always used to say, train, like you fight. There's no, and what I would get involved with other bankers and try to give them insights or help them or whatever, I'd always say, report the same way you manage. So, and your eye will get calibrated. You'll see things that are out of place. Don't have different types of presentations for different stakeholders. It just shouldn't be that way. When you look at your CECL, distribution of accounts, it's instantly recognizable because you see the same thing on the call report, basically. That's a good way to be because you become more efficient. You're much more confident about the quality of the data, and you're not doing what you were just describing, where somebody's always, asking the chief operating officer, can you do a business analytics report that maybe has this or that? Just come up with, a method of managing the risk internally is the same way that you communicate that risk to all the various stakeholders.
Yep. Wonderful. So, Andy, as we wrap up here, are there any final thoughts that you have for those that are, just coming to the CECL discussion, just looking at CECL, perhaps looking at their CECL reports perhaps for the first time, or even thinking about a CECL vendor for the first time?
So, I keep learning things all the time. I learn things from chatting with people who are trying to make decisions, reach out. Sometimes it's referrals. It's just, RMA style, sharing best practice, that kind of thing. I tell a lot of people that I wouldn't get too preoccupied with the finer points of the model. It's more similar than it is different. So, this an elaborate, picking, this model or that. Did you run 3 or 4 models and then compare them or something? I wouldn't get too preoccupied with that. That fidelity of the data, your whole focus on that we just started talking about, that is such a big part of it. If you've done that correctly, what I think is going to happen over the next couple of years is feedback will occur. Institutions will provide feedback to their vendor partners. The product will continue to evolve. The presentation of the product. Yes, there are different methodologies and so on, but I think so you shouldn't get too preoccupied with trying to compare and contrast. There are some real quality ones out there that have been around for a while. Like I said before, I can't practically see the benefit of trying to do it yourself. It's just, there are too many advantages that I, already discussed on that front. And I know I will, as we move forward and then begin the back testing side of things, we'll have the valuable feedback we need to continue to tweak the model. And then I anticipate that it'll be relatively hands-off by most people in the company, which is an important thing. And as long as because it's just data in the loan accounting system, we don't manipulate it. It doesn't have anything to do with risk rating anymore. I mean, you're going to get a pretty pure glass of water from this eventually at the end of the day. And the big thing will just be comparing what your actual losses were to what in any given period were the incurred losses. And then you'll have ammunition to sort of what if your model a little bit more and true that up. And I think that the labor that has been involved in nearly the last 20 years over the allowance for loan losses, particularly for small companies, it's going to disappear. I mean, I think, I don't think that one day it'll seem a lot less burdensome.
Well, Andy, here's to that future.
We'll have other challenges, but
that's for certain. There's always something. Yeah. Andy, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. A great discussion, and look forward to future discussions. Thanks so much, Andy.
Don't forget to join us for part 2. We'll discuss with Andy his experience in getting started with CECL, how his exposure and participation prepared his institution for CECL, and why he feels a spreadsheet might not be the right approach for most institutions. For more information about CECL, visit pcbb.com/products/CECL. You can watch and listen to all of our podcast episodes on our Banking Out Loud webpage at pcbb.com/podcast.